Hello there and welcome once again to The Verdict. Mick Cornett with Kent Meyers. We're here every week dealing with interesting topics, and this week a little bit different of a show. We're going to preview a documentary about Oklahoma City's history.
Yeah, it's a documentary that you did, shepherded, put together, and tell us a little bit about that and why you did it, just briefly.
Well, it just seemed to me in kind of talking to people who had been through the 1980s and 90s, and it was just such a tumultuous time in Oklahoma City's history, and then you would meet younger people who had no idea about it. I thought, this story needs to be told. There's a famous Oklahoman named Paul Harvey who made a living on the franchise of the rest of the story. Well, this is the rest of the story. You see what Oklahoma City's like today. This is the rest of the story. These are the troubling times from the 80s and 90s that got us there.
If you pay close attention to the troubling times of the 80s and 90s, you really marvel that we even made it to today.
That's right. It's the movie is titled Oklahoma City, the Boom, the Bust, and the Bomb, and we're going to show a couple of clips later today on The Verdict. So rejoin us after this break and we'll get right to it.
I've been fortunate enough to premiere every film that I've produced at Sundance. Seeing your film on the big screen for the first time in front of an audience at the Sundance Film Festival is unmatched. I'm Chad Burris. I'm an attorney, a film producer, film financier, economic development financier, and I'm Chickasaw. Nobody can argue that modern day media, cinema, has perpetuated this myth, this idea of the Indian and what that is. And just the idea that, all Indians look one way or all Indians act one way is a terrible injustice. Being able to have filmmakers tell stories that are representative of some element of his surroundings, his upbringing, what they know, what they see through their own eyes, that other people get a chance to bear witness to around the world. I think that's amazing. For me personally, being an Indian today means being responsible, honest, progressive, and giving that back to the community.
Learn more about today's Chickasaws at profilesofanation.com.
Welcome back to the set of The Verdict. This show is a little bit different than what we typically do, but I have produced a documentary about Oklahoma City's history between the years 1970 and 1995. And Kent and I are just reminiscing about those ages, and we're going to show a clip of the documentary here in just a moment. But the 1970s were an interesting time.
Well, indeed they were. It was a very active time, and the money was flowing, the ties were as white as shirts, and the color of the leisure suits got brighter as the decade went along.
People were spending like there was no tomorrow.
Yeah, and what they bought made others hope there'd be no tomorrow. But you're right, it was a wild time here in Oklahoma City.
Yeah.
Certainly different than most of the country.
Yeah, it was an economy. I think as we're going to learn in this clip, based on scarcity. We just felt like the price of oil was going to go up forever, and the people in the energy industry were spending like they had no concerns about their financial futures.
Oh, it was all directly in front of them.
Let's take a look. This is a clip entitled The Boom, and it talks about the late 70s and early 80s and how it affected Oklahoma and its economy.
As predicted, the price of oil continued to rise, and Oklahoma's economy had seemingly never been better.
The spiraling prices going up on everything related to the oil business. It wasn't just the price of oil, which at that time was spiraling up, but the price of all the services that go along with it, the trucking, the tubing, the drilling rigs, the employees.
Oh, I just remember people buying houses, buying airplanes. I mean, it was an anything goes atmosphere on one level, and then on another level, it was the community that you think of, which is it's a great place to raise children, you know, God-fearing people, active church community, and then there was this other culture that ran underneath.
I was in the process of starting my own business. In fact, I started it in '79, but I'd never seen anything like that.
A legendary quarterback at Douglas High School in the 1950s, Russell Perry used those leadership skills to transition to the world of business. He started a newspaper in 1979. It allowed him to be an eyewitness to the success and the excess of the era.
And I saw more gold watches and limousines and Cadillacs ever before in this state. And so it put us in a very interesting time frame there.
I kept wondering, how come I'm not making any money? All these guys are making so much money.
Burns Hargis was a lawyer whose firm represented the FDIC, the organization that helps to regulate banks. A young man with a promising future, he fought the temptation to jump into the oil business.
Yeah, a lot of guys did that. I was practicing law. I studied hard in school. I thought I'd done okay, but as it was, I mean, we were just the poor country cousins compared to all these other people, the fancy cars, the jet airplanes, the yachts, the Grand Lake cruisers that were going on. You had this kind of arms race over on Grand Lake because somebody'd get a bigger boat, creating bigger waves, so people would get bigger boats to deal with the bigger waves, and you just had this constant escalation of waves until they all finally came crashing down.
The words that come to mind are rock and roll, because it didn't just build slowly, it exploded.
Terry Watkins was a journalist, learning the trade in the late 1970s.
It was just like all of a sudden somebody dumped $1 million in downtown Oklahoma City and they decided to have a giant party. So it wasn't just excess, it was overwhelming, massive greed, and I want to be somebody. And of course nobody thought it would end. Nobody wanted it to end.
And business at Penn Square Bank was seemingly booming.
Bill Jennings was a good friend, and I'd known him for a number of years, so we watched with probably consternation as opposed to awe, because it was pretty clear that many of the things they were doing was not sustainable.
They thought that all these wells were good. The tendency was there was two geologists at Penn Square, and one evaluated things real high, that you had huge reserves, and one, you know, accounted for them in a more of a normal fashion. The high one got all the business, and so there was this over-enthusiasm that the reserves were always going to be there, that the prices were going to continue to go up, and that all would be good in the end.
Well, we would have people approach us for refinancing them. They were at finance at Penn Square, and they probably had already borrowed 2 or 3 times what we were willing to lend them, so refinancing was not an option. We refused to take Penn Square CDs, for example, as collateral.
And that last soundbite was from Gene Rainbolt of Bank First, and you could see that he was concerned. Refusing to take another bank's CD sounds like a pretty big step.
Well, it certainly is. It's a death sentence for the issuer of the CD that can't get it marketed. But the atmosphere in the community at that time, right before the failure of Penn Square Bank, was a mixture of this thing's going to be good forever on the one hand, and oh my goodness, the sky is falling on the other. The problem was very few had the sky is falling attitude, and most had this is going to be good forever. And I recall on July 4th, 1982, the day before the Penn Square Bank failed, being at a function where Penn Square Bank official told me in response to an inquiry of things I'd heard on the street about there's trouble at Penn Square Bank. Don't worry about it. Doors will be open the next day as usual. Everything's fine. We've got it all under control. Well, the doors were somewhat open. They were open to the regulators the next day, but nobody else.
Yeah. Banks hadn't been shut down in that generation. They had been shut down in the 1930s, and occasionally we'll hear of a bank being closed now. But back then, that was all new to that generation.
Well, and we had some of the pillars of our financial community deeply involved in Penn Square transactions, either directly or through participations and the like. And the swath cut by Penn Square Bank's failure cut deep into the banking community, as well, of course, as the energy community. The energy community looking to Penn Square Bank for financing, or at least being the conduit for the financing through others. And when all that dried up, things went downhill very rapidly.
I mean, tens and hundreds of millions of dollars were pouring into Oklahoma from out-of-state banks, and Penn Square was supposedly looking after these loans and making sure that the borrowers were good for it. And as we know now, they weren't, and especially when the price of energy dropped.
Yes, there was real competition among the major banks, Seattle First, Continental Illinois, Michigan National, and others, Seafirst, for Penn Square Bank loans, or for loans into the oil and gas industry through Penn Square Bank as the conduit. And banks were competing for that business at first. Later, they couldn't get off the ship fast enough, and some of them didn't make it.
Yeah. Well, we're going to take a break and then come back, and in the next segment we'll show another clip that kind of picks up after Penn Square Bank folds and tries to show what the community was like in the days and months after Penn Square Bank folds. But this is a show that we're discussing the new documentary, The Boom, the Bust, and the Bomb, the story of Oklahoma City from 1970 to 1995. We'll be back on The Verdict after this.
It's a North American energy revolution. We're the fastest growing source of new oil and natural gas supplies in the world.
The shift to North American energy will create approximately 3 million jobs.
All that money we've been sending overseas, $400 billion a year. Imagine that staying in our economy. It's a game changer.
Real energy independence starts now, and it starts with Oklahoma.
The good life comes naturally to Tulsa, where nature's beauty is matched with an eye for aesthetics. A legacy of neighborhoods graced with lawns and landscaping and handsome homes. A place that seems to have patented an ideal lifestyle. Bank First is loyal to the quality of life Tulsa assures its citizens, to the priority placed on education, culture, and growth. Loyal to builders who transform raw land into residential charm. Developers who see opportunity and add vitality to Tulsa's economy. Bank First serves both enterprise and private lives that need a loyal partner. It's how we help nurture this city's very good life. Bank First. Loyal to Oklahoma. Loyal to you.
Welcome back to the set of The Verdict. Mick Cornett and Kent Meyers. We're reminiscing in a way, but we're talking about something that's current. I have produced a new documentary on Oklahoma City's history from the years 1970 to 1995 called Oklahoma City, The Boom, the Bust, and the Bomb. And we're showing a couple of clips here that have to do with the energy crisis of the early 1980s and its impact on Oklahoma. And the impact was striking.
Well, it was indeed. And I can't tell you how many times within the last year I've had people talk to me or suggest to me that because of the dramatic lowering of the price of oil on the open market, ask the question, are we approaching another Penn Square Bank meltdown in the oil and gas industry? And my only response is, I hope not.
Yeah. Well, you know, the banking regulations are much tighter today than they were then. And as you look back at Penn Square and some of the casual culture of extending loans, you know, writing things in the back of a napkin. Sometimes the borrowers hadn't even signed the loan papers.
Yeah.
It was all based on the fact that the price of energy is never going to go down, so all these loans are of course going to be good.
Yes.
But when the price did drop, then the loans weren't good, and there was a domino effect that took down our economy, you know, for 10 years. And you know, it might have happened differently, but the FDIC in retrospect may have acted a little aggressively, and the documentary, you know, is pretty, I hope, fair, but at the same time is critical of some of the FDIC's moves and how they decided that you know, if it seemed to be an Oklahoma bank, you know, just let it go.
Well, the collateral damage theory was prevalent in FDIC's handling. Well, if we do this and this kills 5 other banks, so what? Or 5 other borrowers, or whatever it may be. We're addressing the problem in a forthright and forceful way, and the fact that others get hurt is just too bad.
In this next clip that we're going to see from the documentary, it picks up after the Penn Square Bank has failed, and the community now kind of collectively looks at itself and says, now what? Here it is, the boom, the bust, and the bomb.
Penn Square Bank was history. Cleaning up the financial mess left behind would take years. In Oklahoma, the energy industry and the banking industry were in a free fall. In the previous 10 years, the price of Oklahoma crude oil had increased tenfold. As a result, the number of people working in the oil and gas industry had increased from 34,000 to 102,000. Oklahoma had been a poor state for a long time, but by 1982, the state's per capita income was almost identical to the national rate. When the crash hit in the summer of '82, many predicted the economy would bounce right back. Others predicted a long, slow path to recovery. In reality, it would be longer and slower than anyone could have imagined. The collapse of Penn Square was really just the beginning of the long slide for Oklahoma banks.
I don't think anyone that day foresaw all the implications of what was to come, how many additional banks would fail, and how many banks that had actually been prudent lenders failed.
We became an economic pariah in the country. Everybody associated us with Penn Square. Any deals that came out of Oklahoma, whether it be in this area or other areas, were suspect that maybe it was some kind of a fraud. It just got worse and worse. We went from the 4th most profitable state for banks to the 49th most profitable. You also had downstream banks, small community banks, that got some of these loans from Penn Square, and they were horribly affected.
If there was one bank that probably should have been bailed out, as sorry as it had been run and supervised, Penn Square was probably one that should have been. While other larger banks, but not nearly as important to the economy banks, should have been allowed to fail. I think it is sad that the regulators kind of said, well, if the bank's from Texas or Oklahoma, let it go.
At the end of the day, the banks that really, not so much Penn Square, but the banks that really had trouble after that was driven by commercial real estate. It's just the point where you're a bank and you've got a mortgage on commercial real estate, and the value of that real estate goes down. There's nothing you can do, and you can't get rid of it. I mean, and you got to worry about insuring it. You got to worry about maintaining it, fixing the roof. I mean, it just is a cancer that just eats into your whole system.
So we had a collapse in the real estate market. We had a collapse ultimately in the production of oil and gas and agricultural prices and agricultural land. So everything that was good in Oklahoma stopped, or at least had a very, very significant downturn. So that was just the beginning of the bank failures.
And I had no idea at the time that I'd be covering bank closings for 6 years. 6 years.
Continental Bank of Illinois was hit the hardest. In one quarter, it wrote off over $1 billion in losses. It was the worst 3-month period by a U.S. corporation in American history. Eventually, the federal government would move in and take it over, perhaps saving another 100 banks in the process. Sometimes, it seemed like a person was better off with debt than with assets.
And I think had the FDIC in particular proceeded differently, a lot of banks that failed would not have had to, because I think they got into a panic mode. You know, if they had, inventoried collateral, looked at it carefully, liquidated it slowly rather than, panic sales. And I know of pieces of equipment that went for 10 cents on the dollar, 6 months after somebody bought it new.
I'll tell you, it went from one extreme to another, as I can recall. It went from seeing expressways and highways impacted with automobiles, with the boom and gloom of the state, and then all of a sudden after Penn Square, you could hardly see an automobile on the highway. It was just that desolate. So it was very, very, very confusing, very complex, and I don't know if anybody was prepared for that.
It was a very, very sad time because you'd literally sit around the dinner table and talk about the financial difficulties that friends of yours were having. Although there was one funny moment. My children, who were, I guess, 8 and 9 or so, 9 and 10, about that age at the time, and would sit and listen to this conversation. One Saturday, my daughter was reading the USA Today, and there was a picture of a baseball diamond. And on the baseball diamond, it had the highest paid player for each player. And she was saying to her brother, look, Tyler, here's a center fielder who makes, I don't know, $2 million, and here's a pitcher, wow, he makes a whole lot of money, and going through these various positions and how much they made, and then there's this pause, and she says, Tyler, can Dad play baseball? Knowing enough, not knowing a lot, but knowing that I was in the oil and gas business, and that seemed to be a bad place to be, because at dinner we were talking about people going broke all the time. And I said to myself, as I laughed in the other room, no, I can't play baseball at all, so I better make this work.
And another clip from The Boom, The Bust, and The Bomb, the new documentary about Oklahoma City's history from 1970 to 95. I should mention that was obviously Larry Nichols with Devon Energy in that final clip. Previous you saw Russell Perry, Burns Hargis, and John Yokel, an oil and gas investor, driller, and previously to that, a banker, is another expert who talks about the excess and the troubling times.
Well, it wasn't all bad. The failure of Penn Square and the subsequent mushrooming of bankruptcies was great for lawyers who did bankruptcy work. So what was next? Enter the bankruptcy lawyers.
Yeah.
Prior to this time, our bankruptcy courts were looking for things to do. They didn't have enough business to keep them busy on a full day. And after this time, we had to add temporary bankruptcy judges. Lawyers were coming in from all over the country. It was a real nightmare to try to sort it out.
The rest of the 1980s decade was continuing efforts by the leadership in Oklahoma City to try and kickstart the economy. There was all sorts of ideas about building a stadium and perhaps attracting an NFL team, and eventually trying to bring in a United Airlines facility that might bring a lot of jobs to Oklahoma City. And ultimately, as we know, Mayor Norick and the MAPS process was a igniter of the economy that we have today. Kent and I are going to take a break. We'll be back and then wrap up this show. We're visiting the documentary, Oklahoma City, The Boom, The Bust, and The Bomb.
All children deserve a life of hope and love, but sometimes they experience a life of pain, neglect, and abuse.
When that happens, each child deserves all the quality assistance and representation that can be offered in our legal system. For more information, call 23-CHILD.
Oklahoma Lawyers for Children, helping to bring hope and love back to the lives of abused children.
You will always be Mom and Dad to me.
We are a very conservative family, and we believe in old-fashioned family values. We have a loving home there, and we love kids, and we had 5, 6 of our own, and but had no idea we were going to go into adoption, but it's been very gratifying.
You will always be Mom and Dad to me.
The Journal-Record is pleased to be a sponsor of The Verdict. The Journal-Record, since 1903, the best source of Oklahoma business news and legal information. And for almost 30 years, Oklahoma political, government, and business leaders have turned to the McCarville Report for accurate, reliable, inside information. Visit the McCarville Report online.
Welcome back to the set of The Verdict. We have spent this half hour discussing the new documentary, Oklahoma City, the Boom, the Bust, and the Bomb. And you were telling me during the break that you had some friends who saw these escalating prices for drilling rigs and drilling and just said, I just can't afford it.
Yeah, I can't compete. I can't get a drilling rig. There's a great shortage, but they've got the price of drilling rigs so high. It's well beyond what it's worth, and I'm not going to place my money there, so I'm just not going to drill. Those are the folks that who didn't get involved in this upward rush of spending money that are still around today and still profitable in the oil business today.
Much of this documentary deals with the entrepreneurs who survived it.
Yep. And
so you look at the large corporate headquarters we have of energy companies today that are still around, and you think, well, how did they make it through the 1970s and especially the 1980s? And those are interesting stories too, and they all did it in different ways. So I hope people will enjoy the documentary. I hope you have a chance to see it. I suspect it'll be available in a variety of ways that movies are distributed these days, including movie theaters. But the documentary is Oklahoma City, the Boom, the Bust, and the Bomb, and I hope you enjoyed today's show. For Ken, I'm Mick. We'll see you next week on The Verdict.